Imagine walking into divorce court, 8 months pregnant, and your husband arrives arm in arm with his influencer mistress, live streaming your humiliation. Now picture this. Before the gavel drops, the judge presses play, and a secret recording detonates an empire. In 60 seconds, you'll see how a perfect millionaire becomes a felon, how a daughter coached to lie flips on the stand, and how a hospital whisper turns into the one confession nobody can unhear. Who wired the money? Who cut the deal? And when the ankle monitor hits the floor, who's already waiting in the dark? Stay with me. Every clue you catch now will make the final twist hit harder. If high-stakes justice, courtroom shockwaves, and mothers who refuse to break are your thing, you're in the right place. Tap like to boost the story, drop your boldest theory in the comments, share it with a friend who loves jaw-drop drama, and hit subscribe so you don't miss the moment the truth explodes. The October rain hammered against the courthouse windows like an accusation, each drop a reminder that some storms couldn't be weathered. Elizabeth Sterling stood in the lobby of the Chicago family court, her hand pressed protectively against her 8-month pregnant belly, watching through the glass doors as her husband arrived in his $100,000 Tesla. Marcus Sterling emerged from the vehicle like a king surveying his kingdom, his Italian suit pristine despite the downpour. The millionaire tech entrepreneur didn't even glance at the courthouse entrance where his pregnant wife waited. Instead, he walked around to the passenger side, holding an umbrella over Victoria Rose as she stepped out in her blood-red designer dress and 6-inch heels. The sight shouldn't have hurt anymore, but it did. Elizabeth had seen plenty of photos of her husband's mistress on Instagram over the past 6 months. Victoria Rose, lifestyle influencer and crypto trader, with her perfect blonde hair and surgically enhanced everything. But seeing her here at their divorce proceedings was a cruelty Elizabeth hadn't prepared for. "Deep breaths, Liz," she whispered to herself, feeling the baby kick in response. "We're going to get through this." Her phone buzzed with a text from her lawyer, Sarah Anderson. "Running late, start without me if needed." Elizabeth's stomach dropped. Sarah had seemed distant lately, less responsive to calls, but surely she wouldn't abandon her client on the most important day of the proceedings. The courthouse doors burst open, and Marcus strutted in with Victoria on his arm. He was actually smiling, his phone held up as Victoria live-streamed their entrance. "And here we are at the courthouse," Victoria chirped to her followers, "supporting my man through this difficult time. Some women just don't know when to let go, you know?" Marcus's eyes finally found Elizabeth across the lobby. For a moment, something flickered in them. Guilt? Regret? But then Victoria whispered something in his ear, and he laughed, the sound echoing off the marble floors. Elizabeth turned away, making her way slowly to courtroom 7A. Each step felt heavier than the last. She'd been experiencing complications with the pregnancy, high blood pressure, and early contractions, but she couldn't afford to miss this hearing. Not when everything was at stake. The courtroom was smaller than she'd expected, all worn wood and faded beige walls. She took her seat at the plaintiff's table, alone. The defendant's table was quickly filled with Marcus's legal team, led by Robert Hamilton, whose reputation for destroying wives in divorce court was legendary. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Helen Carter," the bailiff announced. Judge Carter entered with the bearing of someone who had seen too many marriages die in this room. She was in her late 50s, with silver hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes that missed nothing. Elizabeth had researched her, knew she was going through her own divorce. Maybe that would help. Maybe that would make her understand. "Be seated," Judge Carter said, her voice carrying the weight of authority. "We're here for Sterling versus Sterling, case number 2024-4567, final divorce proceedings and asset division." She looked at Elizabeth's empty chair beside her. "Mrs. Sterling, where is your counsel?" Elizabeth stood carefully, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Your Honor, my attorney is running late. She should be here any moment." Hamilton stood immediately, his smile sharp as a blade. "Your Honor, we motion to proceed. My client has taken valuable time from his business operations to be here, but Miss Sterling's inability to secure reliable counsel shouldn't delay these proceedings." Judge Carter frowned, looking at Elizabeth's obvious pregnancy, her pale face. Mrs. Sterling, are you prepared to represent yourself if necessary? Before Elizabeth could answer, the courtroom doors opened. But it wasn't Sarah Anderson who entered. It was Elizabeth's teenage daughter, Rachel, and she walked straight to Marcus's side of the courtroom. Rachel? Elizabeth's voice broke. Sweetheart, what are you doing here? Rachel, 16 and all sharp angles and rebellion, didn't even look at her mother. Dad asked me to come, said it was important I see this. The betrayal was a physical pain, worse than any contraction. Her own daughter choosing sides, choosing him. Your Honor, Hamilton continued smoothly, we have several witnesses who can attest to Mrs. Sterling's unfortunate pattern of behavior during the marriage. Her inability to maintain professional counsel is just one example of her instability. Elizabeth's phone buzzed, a text from Sarah Anderson. I can't do this. I'm sorry. The words blurred as tears threatened. Her lawyer had abandoned her. Her daughter had chosen her father. And there sat Marcus with his mistress, both of them looking at her like she was something pathetic. But then the baby kicked again, hard, and Elizabeth felt something steal in her spine. She stood up straighter. Your Honor, she said, her voice carrying across the courtroom, I request a brief recess to contact alternate counsel. Mrs. Sterling, Judge Carter's voice was not unkind, but firm. I'm inclined to proceed. You've had months to prepare for this day. Mr. Hamilton, please begin your opening statement. Robert Hamilton rose from his chair with practiced ease, his $1,000 shoes clicking against the floor as he moved to the center of the courtroom. Elizabeth noticed how he positioned himself so that she had to turn her pregnant belly awkwardly to see him, a subtle power play that made her skin crawl. Your Honor, Hamilton began, his voice smooth as aged whiskey, what we have here is a simple case of incompatibility. My client, Marcus Sterling, built a $75 million tech empire through his own brilliance and determination. He revolutionized data analytics for real estate markets, created jobs for hundreds of people, and contributed millions to this city's economy. He paused, letting the weight of Marcus's success fill the room. Victoria smiled from the gallery, her phone discreetly recording despite the no-phones rule. Mrs. Sterling, Hamilton continued, was a moderately successful interior designer when they met. She had a small firm, a few clients, nothing remarkable. Mr. Sterling fell in love with her and offered her a life of luxury, asking only that she support his vision. He paid off her business debts, set her up in a beautiful home, and gave her everything she could want. Elizabeth's hands clenched in her lap. That wasn't how it happened. She'd designed the lobbies that made Marcus's first building stand out. Her elegant, sophisticated style had been crucial to attracting high-end clients. And she hadn't had debts. She'd had investments in her growing business. But Mrs. Sterling couldn't be satisfied, Hamilton went on. She became obsessed with control, with monitoring my client's every move. She hired private investigators. She hacked into his emails. She created such a toxic home environment that my client had no choice but to seek comfort elsewhere. Objection, Elizabeth said, standing despite the pain in her back. That's a complete fabrication. Judge Carter looked at her. Mrs. Sterling, you're not an attorney. You can't make objections. If you have evidence to counter Mr. Hamilton's claims, you'll have your chance to present it. Elizabeth sat down, her face burning. Without a lawyer, she was drowning already. Hamilton smiled sympathetically, the expression never reaching his eyes. We understand Mrs. Sterling is emotional. The pregnancy has been difficult, and she's facing the reality of life without my client's financial support. But that doesn't change the facts. He returned to his table and picked up a folder. Your Honor, we're prepared to show that Mrs. Sterling contributed minimally to the marital assets. While she did design a few building interiors early in the marriage, this was hobby work at best. The real growth of Sterling Enterprises came from my client's innovations in predictive analytics and his strategic partnerships. Marcus nodded along, his expression serious and businesslike. He'd worn his most conservative suit, Elizabeth noticed, and had styled his silver-touched hair to look distinguished rather than flashy. Every detail calculated to make him look like the responsible party. Furthermore, Hamilton continued, we have evidence that Mrs. Sterling has been unfaithful to the marriage with one David Morrison, a private investigator she supposedly hired to follow my client, but with whom she developed an inappropriate relationship. Elizabeth gasped. David was her childhood friend who'd helped her gather evidence of Marcus's affairs. They'd never been anything but platonic. Hamilton produced several photographs, passing copies to the judge and sliding one across to Elizabeth. They showed her and David at a coffee shop, his hand on hers across the table, another of them embracing outside her house. The angles and timing made everything look intimate, romantic. These photographs were taken over the past 3 months, Hamilton said, during which time Mrs. Sterling was already pregnant. We question whether Mr. Sterling is even the father of this child. The accusation hung in the air like poison. Elizabeth saw Rachel's face crumble slightly, the first crack in her angry facade. Even Marcus shifted uncomfortably. But Victoria looked delighted, her lips curved in a satisfied smile. Your Honor, Elizabeth said, standing again despite the judge's earlier warning. Those photos are taken completely out of context. David Morrison is a family friend who was comforting me during a difficult time, and Marcus knows perfectly well he's the father of this baby. We were actively trying to conceive. I have the fertility clinic records, which you'll have the opportunity to present, Judge Carter interrupted. Mr. Hamilton, continue. Hamilton nodded graciously. We're prepared to offer Mrs. Sterling a generous settlement. The house in Wilmette, valued at $800,000, $200,000 in cash, and $2,000 per month in child support, pending paternity confirmation. For a marriage of only 5 years, where my client's wealth was largely accumulated before and after the relationship, this is more than fair. Elizabeth did quick math. The settlement represented less than 2% of Marcus's net worth. Meanwhile, she'd given up her business, her career, her independence for their marriage. She'd supported him through the early years when he was working 20-hour days. She'd hosted the dinner parties that secured his first major investors. Mr. Hamilton, Judge Carter said, studying the documents, I see here that Sterling Enterprises was founded 2 years into the marriage. How can you claim the wealth was accumulated outside the relationship? For the first time, Hamilton looked slightly less confident. The intellectual property that formed the basis of the company was developed by my client before the marriage. Mrs. Sterling had no involvement in the technical aspects of the business. I see. Judge Carter made a note. Miss Sterling, are you prepared to make your opening statement? Elizabeth stood, her legs shaky. Without Sarah Anderson, without her prepared documents, she felt like she was walking into battle unarmed. But she thought of the baby, of the future she needed to secure, and found her voice. Your Honor, Mama, Elizabeth began, her voice steadier than she felt. I need to tell you about the real Marcus Sterling. Not the successful entrepreneur sitting there in his designer suit, but the man who convinced me to give up everything for a marriage that he destroyed. She moved carefully around the table, her hand supporting her belly. The baby had been restless all morning, responding to her stress. When I met Marcus 7 years ago, I owned Sterling Interiors, a boutique design firm with 12 employees and annual revenues of $2 million. I wasn't some struggling artist he rescued. I had clients, contracts, and a 5-year expansion plan. Marcus's jaw tightened. He hadn't expected her to come out swinging. Marcus hired me to design the interiors for his first 3 buildings. He was brilliant with technology but had no sense of aesthetics. The lobbies I created became the signature of Sterling Properties. Elegant, sophisticated spaces that justified the premium rents he wanted to charge. She pulled out her phone, her hands trembling slightly. Your Honor, I have photos of my original designs, the contracts, the reviews from Architecture Digest calling them revolutionary applications of space and light. But more importantly, I have this. Elizabeth connected her phone to the courtroom's display system, something she'd practiced the night before when she couldn't sleep. An email appeared on the screen. This is from Marcus to his first major investor, James Whitmore, dated 3 months after our wedding. He writes, Liz's designs have increased our rental inquiries by 300%. Her vision is transforming Sterling Properties from a tech company with buildings into a luxury lifestyle brand. I've convinced her to close her firm and work exclusively on our projects. It's the smartest acquisition I've ever made. Hamilton stood. Your Honor, this email was obtained without my client's consent. It was in our shared family email account. Elizabeth interrupted, the one we used for household matters. I have every legal right to access it. Judge Carter studied the email. Continue, Mrs. Sterling. Elizabeth took a breath. The next part would be harder. After I closed my firm, I didn't just design buildings. I managed our household, raised our daughter, and served as the unofficial social director for Sterling Enterprises. Every dinner party, every charity gala, every investor meeting at our home, I organized. I was the one who convinced James Whitmore's wife to support our bid for the Lakeshore development. I was the one who smoothed things over when Marcus insulted the mayor's wife at a fundraiser. She looked at Rachel, who was staring at her phone, deliberately not making eye contact. I was also the one who stayed home with our daughter when she had nightmares, who drove her to gymnastics and debate club and therapy when the divorce started affecting her grades. While Marcus was building his empire, I was building our family. Mom, stop, Rachel said suddenly, her voice sharp. Just stop playing the victim. The words cut deep, but Elizabeth continued. I'm not a victim, Rachel, but I'm also not going to let your father rewrite history. She turned back to the judge. 6 months ago, I discovered Marcus was having an affair with Victoria Rose. But it wasn't just an affair. He'd been funding her cryptocurrency trading with money from our joint accounts. $3 million transferred over 4 months. Victoria shifted in her seat, her smile faltering. When I confronted him, Elizabeth continued, he didn't deny it. He said I'd gotten boring, that I'd let myself go, that Victoria understood his vision for the future in a way I never could. Her voice cracked slightly. I was 5 months pregnant at the time. We'd been trying for 2 years to have another child. We'd gone through 3 rounds of IVF. She pulled up more documents on the screen. These are our fertility treatment records. Every appointment, Marcus was there. He was excited. He talked about names, looked at nursery furniture. We even started converting the guest room. She paused. That was before Victoria posted a photo from that same guest room on her Instagram, wearing my grandmother's necklace. The courtroom was silent. Even Hamilton seemed momentarily at a loss. The David Morrison situation that Mr. Hamilton mentioned, Elizabeth said, David is my friend from high school. He's married with 3 kids. I hired him because I needed to know the extent of Marcus's betrayal. Those photos Mr. Hamilton showed, the hand-holding was David showing me pictures of Marcus and Victoria at the Four Seasons. The embrace was him comforting me after I learned Marcus had been telling our friends I was mentally unstable. She faced Marcus directly for the first time. You didn't just cheat on me, Marcus. You systematically destroyed my reputation, my friendships, and tried to turn our daughter against me. And for what? So you could trade me in for a younger model without losing half your fortune? Marcus's face was red now, his composure cracking. You're twisting everything. Mr. Sterling, Judge Carter warned, you'll have your chance to respond. Elizabeth returned to her seat, exhausted but not finished. Your Honor, I'm not asking for revenge. I'm asking for recognition. Recognition that I was a partner in this marriage and in building Sterling Enterprises. That I gave up my career and my independence based on promises Marcus made and broke. And that our child, who Marcus now questions as his, deserves a father who takes responsibility. As she sat down, she felt a sharp pain across her abdomen. Not now, she prayed. Please, not now. Hamilton stood immediately, his attack ready. That was a very emotional presentation, Mrs. Sterling. But emotions aren't evidence. Shall we discuss the actual facts? He pulled out his own set of documents. Mrs. Sterling claims she was instrumental in Sterling Enterprises' success. Yet she's not listed on any corporate documents. She never attended board meetings. She has no technical knowledge of the predictive analytics that are the actual foundation of the company. He clicked through his own presentation. As for the $3 million allegedly transferred to Ms. Rose, those were legitimate consulting fees for her social media marketing services. Rose has 400,000 followers and has brought Sterling Properties into the digital age. Victoria nodded enthusiastically from the gallery. The fertility treatments Mrs. Sterling mentioned? Yes, my client attended some appointments, but he was being a supportive husband to a wife who was increasingly obsessed with having another child, even as their marriage was failing. Hamilton's voice took on a sympathetic tone. Mr. Sterling didn't want to crush her hopes, even as he knew the relationship was ending. Elizabeth felt her blood pressure rising, the room starting to spin slightly. She gripped the edge of the table. As for Mr. Morrison, Hamilton continued, showing more photos. We have evidence of 17 meetings over 2 months. That's excessive for a simple investigation. And look at Mrs. Sterling's face in these images. That's not the face of a woman receiving difficult news. That's the face of a woman in love. The final photo showed Elizabeth laughing at something David had said, her hand on his arm. Out of context, it did look intimate. Your Honor, Hamilton said, building to his crescendo, we also have a witness who can speak to Mrs. Sterling's actual contributions to the marriage and her recent behavior. We call Rachel Sterling to the stand. Rachel Sterling walked to the witness stand like she was walking to her own execution, her 16-year-old frame rigid with tension. She wore the dress Marcus had bought her last week, Elizabeth noticed. The expensive one she'd said was too formal for anything but prom. Rachel, Judge Carter's voice was gentle, I need you to understand that this is a serious proceeding. You'll need to tell the truth. Do you understand? Yes, Your Honor. Rachel's voice was small, nothing like the angry teenager who'd been slamming doors for the past 6 months. Hamilton approached with a paternal smile. Rachel, I know this is difficult. No one wants to see their parents' marriage end, but we need to understand what home life has really been like. Can you tell us about your mother's behavior over the past year? Rachel glanced at her father, who nodded encouragingly. She's been different, paranoid, always checking Dad's phone when he left it around, going through his emails. She hired someone to follow him. How did that make you feel? Hamilton asked. Embarrassed. My friend's parents started talking about it. Everyone knew Mom was acting crazy. Rachel's voice grew stronger. She stopped coming to my gymnastics meets because she was too busy trying to catch Dad doing something wrong. Elizabeth's heart shattered. She'd missed 2 meets, just 2, because she'd been having pregnancy complications. But she couldn't interrupt. What about your father? Hamilton continued. How has he been during this time? He's been great, Rachel said, finally looking animated. He never says bad things about Mom. He just says they grew apart. He bought me a car for my birthday even though Mom said I wasn't ready. He trusts me. The bribe, Elizabeth thought bitterly. The $40,000 Tesla that Rachel crashed within a month. And what about Victoria Rose? Hamilton asked carefully. How do you feel about your father's new relationship? Rachel shrugged. Victoria's cool. She doesn't try to be my mom or anything. She just treats me like an adult. She got me into this exclusive Instagram influencer program. Mom would never understand that kind of thing. Rachel, Hamilton's voice became more serious. Has your mother ever spoken to you about the new baby? She says it's Dad's, but... Rachel trailed off, glancing at her father again. But what? Hamilton prompted. But she's been spending a lot of time with David Morrison, and Dad says the timing is suspicious. The words came out in a rush. I mean, they were basically separated when she got pregnant. That was a lie, and Rachel knew it. Elizabeth and Marcus had been very much together 8 months ago, still trying to work things out. They'd made love the night before Elizabeth found the credit card charges for Victoria's apartment. Judge Carter interrupted. Rachel, do you have personal knowledge of your mother's relationship with Mr. Morrison? Have you seen anything inappropriate? Rachel hesitated. For a moment, Elizabeth saw her daughter, really saw her, the scared child caught between warring parents. Then Rachel's jaw set in a way that was pure Marcus. I saw them hugging in our kitchen. Mom was crying and he was holding her. It lasted a long time. When was this? Judge Carter asked. 2 months ago, right after Mom says she found out about Dad and Victoria. But maybe she was crying because David told her he couldn't leave his wife. Elizabeth stood abruptly, the pain in her abdomen intensifying. Your Honor, that's pure speculation. Mrs. Sterling, please sit down, Judge Carter said firmly. But Elizabeth couldn't sit. The pain was spreading, and she felt wetness between her legs. Your Honor, I need... Mom's always doing this, Rachel said loudly, using the pregnancy to get attention. Last week she said she was having contractions just when Dad was supposed to pick me up. But then she was fine an hour later. The room tilted. Elizabeth gripped the table, her vision blurring. I need a doctor, she managed to say. Oh my God, is she serious right now? Victoria's voice carried from the gallery. The dramatics are unreal. Hamilton sighed theatrically. Your Honor, if Mrs. Sterling needs medical attention, of course we should recess. But this is the third time she's claimed medical issues during proceedings. Elizabeth's legs gave out. She collapsed beside the plaintiff's table, her body curling protectively around her belly. The pain was different now, sharper, wrong. Call 911, Judge Carter commanded, jumping to her feet. Rachel screamed, starting to run toward her mother, but Marcus caught her arm, holding her back. Let the paramedics handle it, he said coldly. Elizabeth lay on the courtroom floor, feeling the blood pooling beneath her. Through the haze of pain, she heard Victoria say, She's probably faking. I've seen videos about this kind of manipulation tactic. Delete that recording right now, Judge Carter's voice was ice. Bailiff, confiscate that phone. The paramedics arrived within minutes, though it felt like hours. As they lifted Elizabeth onto the stretcher, she reached for Rachel. Sweetheart, please. Rachel pulled back, tears streaming down her face. This is what you do. You make everything about you. As they wheeled Elizabeth out, she heard Marcus tell Hamilton, file for emergency custody while she's indisposed. This proves she's unstable. The last thing she saw before the courtroom doors closed was Judge Carter's face, unreadable as stone. The hospital room was too white, too bright, too full of machines that beeped accusations with every heartbeat. Elizabeth woke to find herself alone except for a nurse checking her IV. The baby? Her voice came out as a croak. Stable for now, the nurse said gently. You had a partial placental abruption. We've managed to stop the bleeding, but you'll need to stay on complete bed rest. Any stress could trigger labor, and at 32 weeks, she didn't need to finish. Elizabeth knew the risks. Did my daughter come? The nurse's expression said everything. There's a man named David Morrison in the waiting room. He says he's a family friend? Please send him in. David entered looking haggard. He was a bear of a man, 6'4" with kind eyes and graying temples. His wife Jenny had sent flowers, Elizabeth noticed. Liz, I'm so sorry. I heard what happened in court. Hamilton's filed for emergency custody of Rachel while you're hospitalized. Elizabeth felt the monitors spike with her heart rate. He can't. Rachel's 16. She can choose. Marcus has convinced her you're unstable. He's also filed a motion to proceed with the divorce settlement in your absence, claiming your medical condition makes you unable to participate. David sat down heavily. It gets worse. Victoria's been posting about it on social media. The video of you collapsing has 2 million views. Elizabeth closed her eyes. She filmed me collapsing? Judge Carter confiscated her phone, but she'd already live-streamed it. The comments are brutal, Liz. People are calling you a gold digger, saying you're faking the pregnancy complications to get sympathy. The baby moved, a flutter of protest. Elizabeth placed her hand on her belly. We're okay, little one. We're going to be okay. There's something else, David said, pulling out his laptop. I've been investigating Victoria like you asked. Elizabeth, she's not who she says she is. He turned the screen toward her. Victoria Rose is actually Victoria Russo. She's married to Tommy Russo, a casino owner with connections to organized crime. She's been using Marcus to launder money through real estate investments. Elizabeth stared at the marriage certificate on the screen. Marcus doesn't know? I don't think so. But Liz, there's more. I have video from the Sterling Enterprises security cameras. Marcus and Victoria discussing hiding assets in offshore accounts. They're planning to claim bankruptcy for certain holdings to avoid the divorce settlement. We have to tell Judge Carter, you can't leave the hospital. And your husband's lawyers are pushing to finalize everything while you're here. David's expression was grim. Unless you have someone who can represent you. Elizabeth thought of Sarah Anderson, her lawyer who'd abandoned her. Of all the friends who'd chosen Marcus's side because he was the one with the money and influence. Then she remembered something. My hospital room is being recorded for medical purposes, she said slowly. If someone were to confess something here, thinking I was unconscious. David's eyes widened. Liz, that's dangerous. Call Victoria. Tell her I'm in critical condition, unconscious. Tell her I might not make it, and she should come say goodbye for Rachel's sake. Elizabeth's mind was racing. And David, make sure you mention that my phone is here, the one with all my passwords. 3 hours later, Victoria Rose walked into the hospital room in her designer heels, looking around carefully before approaching the bed. Elizabeth kept her breathing steady, her eyes closed. Well, Victoria said, apparently to the unconscious form, this worked out better than planned. You just couldn't handle the pressure, could you? She laughed, the sound sharp. Marcus actually thought I loved him. These tech millionaires are all the same, so desperate for validation from younger women. She moved closer, and Elizabeth smelled her expensive perfume. You want to know a secret? The baby probably is Marcus's. But after the divorce is final and I'm Mrs. Sterling, there might be a tragic accident. Postpartum depression is so common after all. Elizabeth's heart rate monitor spiked. Victoria glanced at it but continued. Tommy's going to love this setup. Marcus's company is perfect for washing casino money. And when Marcus finds out and tries to leave me? She laughed again. Well, Tommy doesn't do divorce. He does disappearances. The door opened suddenly. What are you doing here? Rachel's voice was sharp with suspicion. Victoria spun around, her smile bright and false. Rachel, I came to check on your mom for you. You must be so worried. I didn't ask you to do that. Rachel moved into the room, her eyes on the monitors. Is she okay? The doctors say it's touch and go, Victoria lied smoothly. Your dad's at the courthouse. The judge agreed to proceed without her. Rachel approached the bed slowly. For the first time in months, she really looked at her mother. Elizabeth's face was pale, her body swollen with pregnancy and IV fluids. She looked vulnerable, human, nothing like the enemy Marcus had painted her as. Mom, Rachel whispered, then louder. Mom, can you hear me? Elizabeth wanted so badly to open her eyes, but she waited. She can't hear you, Victoria said. Come on, let's go get coffee. Your dad's buying you a new car to cheer you up, a Range Rover this time. Stop, Rachel said suddenly. Just stop talking. She stared at Victoria, really seeing her for the first time. The woman was checking her phone, already bored with the hospital scene. You don't care about her at all, do you? Rachel asked. You don't care about any of us. Victoria's mask slipped. Honey, your mother's a grown woman who made her choices. She chose to be boring. She chose to let herself go. She chose to raise me, Rachel interrupted, while Dad was working 20-hour days. She chose to give up her business because Dad said he needed her. She chose to try for another baby because Dad said he wanted a son. Her voice rose. And when did she let herself go? When she was throwing up every morning from the pregnancy? When she was sleeping on the couch because Dad locked her out of their bedroom? When exactly did my mother stop being worthy of basic human decency? Victoria's phone rang. She answered it, turning away. Tommy? Yeah, I'm at the hospital. The wife's probably not going to make it. We can move forward with... She paused, noticing Rachel recording her with her phone. I'll call you back. Who's Tommy? Rachel asked. No one, a business associate. Victoria grabbed for Rachel's phone, but the teenager was quicker. Mom taught me to always document everything, Rachel said, backing toward the door. She said it was the only way to protect yourself from liars. Judge Carter's courtroom had the tense atmosphere of a battlefield when proceedings resumed the next morning. Elizabeth's absence was palpable, her empty chair a silent accusation. Marcus sat with Hamilton, looking confident despite the dark circles under his eyes. Victoria was notably absent. Your Honor, Hamilton began, given Mrs. Sterling's medical incapacitation, we motion to proceed with the settlement as outlined. She's clearly unable to participate in proceedings, and further delays only harm our client. Judge Carter looked at the empty plaintiff's table. Has anyone checked on Mrs. Sterling's condition this morning? She remains hospitalized, Your Honor, Hamilton said smoothly. We've heard she's stable, but unable to attend court. In the interest of... The courtroom doors burst open. David Morrison wheeled Elizabeth in a wheelchair, an IV pole attached, and a nurse beside them. Elizabeth was pale but determined, wearing a hospital gown under a coat. Your Honor, Elizabeth said, her voice weak but clear. I apologize for my appearance, but I couldn't let my family's future be decided without me. Marcus stood up. This is ridiculous. She should be in the hospital. I have my doctor's permission to be here for 2 hours, Elizabeth said, producing a letter. The nurse will monitor my condition. Judge Carter studied the letter. Mrs. Sterling, are you certain you're able to proceed? Your Honor, I have evidence that must be presented today. Evidence about the true nature of my husband's relationship with Victoria Rose and their plans for my child. Hamilton objected immediately. Any evidence should have been submitted during discovery. This evidence came to light yesterday while I was supposedly unconscious. Elizabeth pulled out her phone with trembling hands. Your Honor, may I play a recording? Judge Carter nodded. The courtroom fell silent as Victoria's voice filled the room. The baby probably is Marcus's. But after the divorce is final and I'm Mrs. Sterling, there might be a tragic accident. Postpartum depression is so common, after all. Marcus went white. That's taken out of context. The recording continued with Victoria discussing Tommy Russo, the money laundering, the plans for Sterling Enterprises. When it finished, the courtroom was tomb silent. There's more, Your Honor, Elizabeth said. My daughter Rachel is here. She has something to say. Rachel entered, looking smaller than her 16 years. She avoided her father's eyes as she took the witness stand. Rachel, Judge Carter said gently, you testified yesterday. Are you changing your testimony? I'm telling the truth this time, Rachel said, her voice barely above a whisper. Dad coached me on what to say. He said if I didn't help him, Mom would take all his money and we'd have to move to a small apartment. He said Mom was crazy and would probably hurt the baby if she got custody. She finally looked at Marcus. But I saw Victoria at the hospital. I heard what she said. And I realized Mom's not the crazy one. Mom's not the one who brought a criminal into our lives. Rachel's sweetheart did, Marcus started, but Judge Carter cut him off. Mr. Sterling, we're sorry. You'll remain silent. She turned to Rachel and continued. Mom didn't miss my gymnastics meets because she was paranoid. She missed them because she was bleeding and didn't want to scare me. She didn't hire David Morrison to spy because she was controlling. She did it because Dad was stealing money and she needed proof. Rachel was crying now. And Mom never said bad things about Dad, even when I was horrible to her. She just said that divorce makes people act in ways they normally wouldn't. David Morrison stood. Your Honor, I have additional evidence. Security footage from Sterling Enterprises showing Mr. Sterling and Miss Rose discussing asset hiding, and documentation that Ms. Rose is actually married to Tommy Russo, currently under federal investigation for racketeering. He handed a folder to the bailiff. I also have records showing that Mr. Sterling knew about his wife's pregnancy complications and instructed her doctor not to put her on bed rest because it would interfere with the divorce proceedings. Elizabeth gasped. Dr. Patterson said it was my choice. After Mr. Sterling threatened to sue him for malpractice if he made you miss court, David said. Judge Carter's face was granite. Mr. Sterling, is this true? Marcus stood, his composure finally cracking. Your Honor, this is a setup. Elizabeth planned all of this. She's trying to destroy me. Like you tried to destroy her? Judge Carter's voice was ice. Sit down, Mr. Sterling. She reviewed the documents David had provided, her expression growing darker with each page. Mr. Hamilton, were you aware of any of this? Hamilton looked genuinely shocked. No, Your Honor. Had I known about Miss Rose's criminal connections or Mr. Sterling's attempts to hide assets, I would have withdrawn from the case. I'm sure you would have, Judge Carter said dryly. She looked at Elizabeth. Mrs. Sterling, what are you requesting? Elizabeth struggled to sit straight on her. Your Honor, I want what's fair. 50% of all marital assets, including the hidden ones, full custody of both my children, with supervised visitation for Marcus if he completes counseling, and I want a restraining order against Victoria Rose. That's outrageous, Marcus shouted. This is my company. My money. Mr. Sterling, Judge Carter said, you brought a woman with organized crime connections into your home. You coached your teenage daughter to lie under oath. You attempted to hide assets and potentially endangered your wife's pregnancy. And based on this recording, you may have been party to discussions about harming your wife and unborn child. She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. However, that's not the worst part. The worst part is that you sat in my courtroom and accused your pregnant wife of infidelity when you knew the child was yours. You used your wealth and influence to try to destroy the woman whose only crime was trusting you. Judge Carter stood, an unusual move that made everyone in the courtroom hold their breath. In my 23 years on this bench, I have never encountered a case that so clearly demonstrates the weaponization of wealth against a vulnerable spouse. Her voice carried the weight of controlled fury. Mr. Sterling, you didn't just betray your marriage vows. You attempted to use this court as an instrument of abuse. Marcus's face was ashen. Hamilton had moved slightly away from his client, professionally distancing himself from the disaster. Let's discuss the actual facts, shall we? Judge Carter continued. Mrs. Sterling gave up a successful business at her husband's request. She supported his company's growth with her design expertise and social connections. She raised their daughter largely alone while Mr. Sterling built his empire. And when she became pregnant with a planned child, he abandoned her for a woman who was apparently connected to organized crime. She looked at the documents before her. The forensic accounting Mr. Morrison uncovered shows that Mr. Sterling has systematically hidden approximately $30 million in offshore accounts. That's federal tax evasion, Mr. Sterling. That's prison time. Marcus started to speak, but his lawyer grabbed his arm, whispering urgently. As for the custody matter, Judge Carter continued, I have a 16-year-old who was coached to commit perjury by her father and a pregnant woman whose husband tried to prevent her from receiving necessary medical care. The decision is obvious. She turned to Elizabeth. Mrs. Sterling, I'm granting your request with the following modifications. You will receive 60% of all marital assets, including those hidden offshore. The forensic accounting team will ensure every penny is found. You will have full custody of both children. Mr. Sterling will have no visitation rights for 1 year, after which he may petition for supervised visitation if he completes anger management, parenting classes, and therapy. You can't do this, Marcus erupted. I built that company. With your wife's help, which you acknowledged in writing to your investors, Judge Carter shot back. Furthermore, I'm referring this case to the FBI for investigation of Mrs. Rose's activities and potential money laundering through Sterling Enterprises. I'm also referring Mr. Sterling to the district attorney for investigation of witness tampering, perjury, subornation, and potential conspiracy to commit fraud. She banged her gavel. Mr. Sterling, you are ordered to stay 500 feet away from Mrs. Sterling, except for court-ordered exchanges. Any violation will result in immediate arrest. The courtroom erupted. Hamilton was trying to calm Marcus, who was shouting about appeals and lawsuits. Rachel had run to her mother, sobbing apologies. David was on the phone with federal agents. But Elizabeth felt oddly disconnected from the chaos. The pain medication and exhaustion made everything feel distant, dreamlike. She'd won, but at what cost? Her marriage was destroyed, her daughter traumatized, her health compromised. Mom? Rachel was kneeling beside the wheelchair, mascara streaming down her face. Mom, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. He said you were trying to ruin him. He said you didn't really love us. He made it all sound so logical, and I was so angry. And I just... Shh, Elizabeth stroked her daughter's hair. It's okay, sweetheart. Your dad is very good at making people believe what he wants them to believe. I believed him for years too. But I said such horrible things. I chose him over you when you needed me most. Elizabeth cupped Rachel's face. You're 16. You were manipulated by a master manipulator. The important thing is that you saw the truth in time. The nurse was checking Elizabeth's vitals, frowning. Mrs. Sterling, your blood pressure is spiking. We need to get you back to the hospital. As David wheeled her toward the door, Elizabeth caught sight of Marcus being escorted out by security. He looked smaller somehow, diminished. Their eyes met for a moment, and she saw something flicker there. Regret? Fear? Or just rage at losing control? This isn't over, he shouted. I'll appeal. I'll fight this. Mr. Sterling, Judge Carter said coldly, every word you say is being recorded and can be used against you. I suggest you remain silent. As they passed Victoria's empty seat in the gallery, Elizabeth noticed something glinting on the floor. It was the necklace Marcus had given Victoria, the one she'd been wearing in all her Instagram posts. The chain was broken, as if it had been yanked off in a hurry. She ran, David said quietly. The moment you played that recording, she texted someone and bolted. The FBI is looking for her, but she's probably halfway to Mexico by now. Elizabeth closed her eyes, exhausted beyond measure. It doesn't matter. She's Marcus's problem now, not mine. But as they exited the courthouse, Elizabeth's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. You think you won? This isn't over. Tommy doesn't forgive debts, and your husband owes him $5 million. Guess who's going to pay now? 6 weeks passed in a blur of medical appointments, legal paperwork, and painful reconstructions of life. Elizabeth had been on strict bed rest since the courthouse collapse, monitoring every twinge, every movement of the baby. Rachel had moved back in with her, sleeping on a cot in Elizabeth's room, afraid to leave her alone. The forensic accountants had found more than anyone expected. Marcus hadn't just hidden $30 million. He'd been siphoning money from his investors for years, using elaborate shell companies and cryptocurrency transactions. Sterling Enterprises was built on fraud, and the FBI had frozen all assets pending investigation. He's going to prison, David told Elizabeth during one of his visits. 5 to 10 years minimum. The tax evasion alone would be 3 years, but the wire fraud, the investor fraud, he's finished. Elizabeth felt nothing. No satisfaction, no vindication, just emptiness. What about Victoria? Still missing. But Tommy Russo was arrested last week. He's cooperating with the feds, trying to get a lighter sentence. He claims Victoria was the mastermind, that she targeted wealthy men for money laundering operations. Rachel looked up from her homework. So Dad was just another victim? Your dad made his choices, Elizabeth said carefully. Victoria may have been using him, but he chose to cheat, chose to hide money, chose to try to destroy our family. The doorbell rang and Rachel went to answer it, returning with an envelope. It's from Dad's lawyer. Elizabeth opened it with trembling hands. Marcus was offering a deal. He'd give her everything, all of it. The full $75 million if it wasn't frozen. If she would write a letter to the judge asking for leniency. He wanted to avoid prison. Mom, don't, Rachel said immediately. He doesn't deserve your help. But Elizabeth was staring at the last line of the letter. I know I destroyed everything. I know I failed you and Rachel. I'm not asking for forgiveness. Just mercy? The baby deserves to have a father who isn't in prison. He's manipulating you again, David warned. Elizabeth knew he was right, but she also thought about her son growing up, asking about his father, learning he was in prison. She thought about Rachel, already carrying so much guilt and anger. I'll think about it, she said finally. That night, Elizabeth went into labor. It was too early, 34 weeks, but the stress had finally taken its toll. Rachel called 911 while Elizabeth tried to breathe through contractions that felt like her body was tearing apart. It's too early, she gasped to the paramedics. He's not ready. We've got you, the paramedic assured her. Just breathe. At the hospital, everything moved fast. The baby was in distress, his heart rate dropping with each contraction. They prepped her for an emergency C-section. I want Rachel with me, Elizabeth said. Mom, I'm scared, Rachel admitted, suited up in surgical scrubs. Me too, sweetheart. But we're going to be okay. All 3 of us. The surgery was a blur of lights and voices. Elizabeth felt the pressure, the pulling, and then a cry, weak but determined. It's a boy, the doctor announced. He's small but fighting. They whisked him away to the NICU before Elizabeth could hold him. Rachel stayed with her, holding her hand as they stitched her up. He's going to be okay, right? Rachel asked the nurse. He's a fighter, just like his mom, the nurse said. 3 days later, Elizabeth was finally able to hold her son. He was tiny, covered in tubes and wires, but perfect. Rachel sat beside her, gently touching his little fist. What are you going to name him? Rachel asked. Elizabeth had thought about this. Marcus had wanted to name a son after himself, but that felt wrong now. James, she said finally. After my father, James David Sterling. Dad's going to hate that, Rachel said. Your father doesn't get a vote, Elizabeth replied. A knock at the door interrupted them. A woman entered, well-dressed but tired-looking. Mrs. Sterling, I'm Patricia Vance, Victoria's mother. Elizabeth instinctively pulled James closer. What do you want? To apologize, and to give you this. She handed Elizabeth a USB drive. It's everything Victoria recorded during her time with your husband. Hours of video, audio recordings, everything. She was building a blackmail file. Why are you giving this to me? Patricia's face was etched with shame. Because Victoria is my daughter, and I failed her. I knew what she was becoming, what she was doing, but I ignored it. I can't undo the harm she caused, but maybe this will help with your legal battles. She turned to leave, then paused. Your husband wasn't her first. There were 3 others before him. All wealthy, all married, all destroyed. I should have stopped her years ago. The videos on the USB drive were damning beyond anything Elizabeth had imagined. Marcus admitting to tax fraud, discussing ways to hide money, even joking about having Elizabeth accidentally fall down the stairs if she didn't agree to the divorce. But the worst part was watching him with Victoria, seeing how easily he had replaced his family, how little remorse he showed. I can't watch anymore, Rachel said, turning away from the laptop. How did I not see what he really was? Because he's your father and you loved him, Elizabeth said gently. Love makes us blind sometimes. The FBI had added the recordings to their case against Marcus. His lawyers were now begging for a plea deal, anything to avoid the maximum sentence. The investors he'd defrauded were suing separately, seeking damages that would destroy any possibility of financial recovery. James had been in the NICU for 2 weeks now, getting stronger every day. Elizabeth spent every moment she could with him, Rachel by her side. They were becoming a family, just the 3 of them, stronger for being broken and rebuilt. One evening as Elizabeth was nursing James, her phone rang. It was a number she didn't recognize. Liz, it's me, it's Marcus. She almost hung up, but something in his voice stopped her. He sounded broken. I'm not supposed to contact you, he said, but I had to. I needed to tell you something before I go to prison. They're processing my plea tomorrow. 3 to 5 years if I'm lucky. What do you want, Marcus? I want to tell you that you were right about everything. I destroyed the best thing in my life because I was arrogant and selfish and stupid. I let Victoria convince me that I deserved better, that you were holding me back. But you were the only thing holding me together. Elizabeth said nothing, just listened to his ragged breathing. I saw the pictures Rachel posted of the baby. He looks like me when I was born. My mom sent me my baby pictures, and it's uncanny. His voice broke. I'm going to miss everything. His first words, first steps, first day of school, and it's my own fault. Yes, it is, Elizabeth said simply. I know you have no reason to believe me, but I want to sign over everything to you. No conditions, no plea letters, nothing. The lawyers will have the papers tomorrow. Whatever isn't seized by the feds is yours and the kids. It won't make up for what I did, but maybe it'll help. Why now? Because Victoria's gone, and I'm alone, and I finally see what I threw away. He paused, and because I got a message from Tommy Russo's people. They were going to kill me in prison if I don't pay the $5 million I owe. So I'm going to protective custody, which means 23 hours a day in solitary. I'll go insane in there, Liz, but at least you and the kids will be safe. Elizabeth felt an unexpected pang of pity. Marcus, don't feel sorry for me. I made my choices. Just tell James about me someday. Not the man I became, but the man I was when we first met, when I still had dreams bigger than my greed. The line went dead. The next day the news broke. Marcus Sterling had pled guilty to 15 counts of fraud, tax evasion, and conspiracy. He'd forfeited all assets to pay restitution to investors and the IRS. Elizabeth and the children were awarded everything else, approximately $10 million after debts and penalties. But the bigger news was Victoria Rose, arrested at the Canadian border with a fake passport and $2 million in cryptocurrency. She was charged with money laundering, conspiracy, and fraud. Tommy Russo had given the FBI everything in exchange for witness protection. Rachel watched the news coverage with a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. It's weird seeing Dad in handcuffs. I keep remembering when he taught me to ride a bike, you know? He ran beside me for hours, never letting go until I was ready. People are complicated, Elizabeth said, holding James while he slept. Your father did terrible things, but he also loved you in his broken way. It's okay to mourn the father you thought you had while being angry at the father he turned out to be. 1 year later, Elizabeth stood in the lobby of what used to be Sterling Enterprises, now renamed Phoenix Design Group. She'd bought the building with part of the settlement money and transformed it into a collaborative space for female entrepreneurs recovering from divorce. James toddled around her office, 15 months old and into everything. He had Marcus's eyes, but Elizabeth's smile, and a laugh that could light up any room. Rachel, now 17 and preparing for college applications, was working part-time as Elizabeth's assistant. Mom, you have a visitor, Rachel announced. Says it's important. Elizabeth looked up from her blueprints to see Margaret Thompson, the attorney who'd abandoned her the day of the trial. I know I have no right to be here, Margaret began, but I needed to apologize in person. Marcus paid me $100,000 to drop your case. I was drowning in student loans, and I took it. I've regretted it every day since. Elizabeth studied her former lawyer, seeing the genuine remorse. Did you know what he was planning? The false evidence turning Rachel against me? No, I thought it would be a standard divorce. I never imagined. Margaret stopped. That's no excuse. I betrayed my oath and my client. I've been disbarred. I'm working as a paralegal now, trying to make amends. What do you want from me? Forgiveness? No, I want to give you this. Margaret handed her a check. It's the 100,000 Marcus paid me, plus interest. It's yours. It always should have been. Elizabeth looked at the check, then at Margaret's worn clothes, her tired face. You need this money. Not as much as I need to live with it myself. Elizabeth made a decision that surprised herself. I don't want your money, but I could use a good paralegal, someone who understands what our clients are going through, someone who's learned from their mistakes. Margaret's eyes widened. You'd hire me? After what I did? Everyone deserves a second chance, but betray one of my clients and I'll make sure you never work in law again. I won't. I swear I won't. As Margaret left, Rachel shook her head. You're too forgiving, Mom. Maybe, or maybe I just understand that holding on to anger only hurts us. That evening, they visited Marcus in prison. It was James's first time meeting his father. Marcus was thinner, grayer, wearing orange instead of Armani. He stared at his son through the glass partition with wonder and regret. He's perfect, Marcus whispered into the phone. He looks just like you. He has your stubborn streak, Elizabeth said, trying to keep James from grabbing the phone cord. Daddy, James said clearly, pointing at Marcus. Everyone froze. It was his first real word besides mama. Marcus started crying, pressing his hand against the glass. Hey, buddy. Yeah, I'm your daddy. Rachel had been silent, but now she spoke. Are you getting help? Real help? Therapy twice a week, AA meetings every day. I'm trying, Rachel. I know it's too late for us, but I'm trying to become someone you won't be ashamed of. I'm not ashamed of you, Rachel said quietly. I'm sad for you. You had everything and you threw it away for nothing. Not for nothing, Marcus said. For the illusion of something better. That's the worst part. I destroyed my real life for a fantasy. The guard announced visiting time was over. As they gathered their things, Marcus spoke quickly. Liz, Victoria's trial starts next month. She's claiming I forced her into everything. Be careful. She's dangerous, and she blames you for everything. I'm not afraid of her anymore, Elizabeth said. She has no power over us. But as they left the prison, Elizabeth noticed a black sedan following them. It stayed 3 cars back, but it was there. When she stopped for gas, it pulled into the station across the street. Mom? Rachel had noticed too. It's probably nothing, Elizabeth said, but she took a different route home, making several unnecessary turns. The sedan stayed with them. Finally, at a red light, the sedan pulled alongside them. The window rolled down, and Victoria Rose smiled at them. She looked different, thinner, harder. She held up her hand, showing an ankle monitor, then made a gun gesture at James's car seat before the light changed and she drove away. Elizabeth's hands were shaking as she called 911. Within minutes, police had found the sedan abandoned 2 miles away. Victoria was gone, her ankle monitor cut off and left on the driver's seat with a note. See you soon, Liz. We have unfinished business. The FBI put them in protective custody immediately. Victoria Rose had jumped bail and vanished again, but this time Elizabeth wasn't afraid. She'd survived Marcus's betrayal, a traumatic pregnancy, and rebuilding her entire life. She looked at her children, at the business she'd built, at the community of women she was helping, and realized Victoria had already lost. We're going to be okay, she told Rachel and James as they settled into the safe house. We're stronger than she thinks. We're survivors. 3 weeks later, Victoria was caught trying to flee to Brazil. She'd been hiding in Chicago, planning something the FBI wouldn't specify. She was sentenced to 15 years without parole. During the trial, a detail emerged that explained everything. Victoria had been recording Marcus to blackmail him, yes, but she'd fallen into her own trap. She'd started to believe she actually loved him, that they would build an empire together. When he'd been willing to let her take the fall alone, when he'd chosen his family's safety over protecting her, she'd snapped. Hell hath no fury, the prosecutor had said in closing arguments. But Elizabeth knew better. It wasn't about a woman scorned, it was about a predator losing her prey, a manipulator being outmaneuvered. Victoria had thought she was the smartest person in the room, but she'd underestimated the power of truth and the strength of a mother protecting her children. The day the verdict was read, Elizabeth got a letter from Marcus. Just 4 words. Thank you for James. She didn't reply, but she kept the letter. Someday when James was older, she'd tell him about his father. The whole story, the good and bad, the choices and consequences. She'd teach him to be better, to choose love over greed, family over ambition, truth over convenient lies. 6 months later, at Phoenix Design Group's first anniversary gala, Elizabeth stood before a room full of women who'd rebuilt their lives after divorce. Rachel was beside her, having just gotten her acceptance letter to Northwestern University. James was toddling around, charming everyone with his new favorite word, up. We all have a moment, Elizabeth said to the crowd, when we think our lives are over, when someone we trusted destroys that trust so completely, we don't think we can recover. But we can. We do. We rise from those ashes stronger, wiser, and more compassionate. She raised her glass of sparkling cider. To second chances, to new beginnings, and to the families we choose to build from the ruins of the ones that failed us. The room erupted in applause. Later, as Elizabeth tucked James into bed and helped Rachel with her college essays, she thought about the journey that had brought them here. The pain had been unbearable at times, the betrayal devastating, but it had also revealed her strength, her children's resilience, and the power of truth. Her phone buzzed with a news alert. Marcus had been released early for good behavior and substantial cooperation with federal investigators. He'd helped them uncover a massive money laundering ring that Victoria had been part of, saving the government millions. There was a quote from him, "I've lost everything that mattered, but I've gained something too. The knowledge of who I really am and who I want to become. I hope my children can forgive me someday, but I understand if they can't. I'll spend whatever time I have left trying to earn that forgiveness, even if I never receive it." Elizabeth turned off her phone. Marcus's redemption or lack thereof wasn't her concern anymore. She had her own life to live, her own family to raise, her own dreams to pursue. Tomorrow she would meet with 3 new clients, women beginning their own journeys from betrayal to triumph. She would tell them what she knew now, that the end of one story was just the beginning of another, and that sometimes losing everything was the only way to find out what you were truly made of. Outside, Chicago glittered in the darkness, millions of lights representing millions of stories. Elizabeth's was just one among them, but it was hers. And for the first time in years, she was exactly where she wanted to be.